Good afternoon. This is TANISHA Laverne Grant with BlackInAmerica.com. I am super excited to bring to the platform a woman who is going to go down in history as one of the most iconic leaders of our time, in my opinion. She's just doing so many amazing things and just continuing to elevate the culture. DEBRAADAMSSIMMONS, who is the executive editor of culture at National Geographic. How are you?
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today, Tanisha. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Oh, I just can't wait. I just want to just dive right in. So the June issue is a reckoning of our past, is what it's titled. And from what I understand, there's going to be a series of three major conversations or three major titles, talking about race and culture, correct?
That is correct, but really more than three. But the June issue begins a new phase of the conversation about race in America, and in particular, the African American experience. So the three stories that we have in the June issue it include a story about Tulsa and what happened with Tulsa and how the Tulsa community is really coming to grips with its history and looking at where we go from here as it relates to Tulsa. But we know that Tulsa was not an isolated incident, and there was racial terror across the United States. And so Tulsa really opens the door for us to begin to talk about some of the other things that happened. And Tulsa wasn't the first story where we explored this. After George Floyd was killed last year, we did a digital story that looked at the Red Summer, which focused on racial terror across the United States, in Elaine, Arkansas, and Washington, D.C., and not just in the American South, really all over the country. And that stories like that help us put this moment in context. And that's part of the work that we've tried to do at National Geographic. And there will also be a two-part documentary about Tulsa, where we sort of focus on Tulsa rising again in spite of everything that has occurred. So that's one of the pieces in our June issue. But we also hear from historian and scholar Elizabeth Alexander, who talks about the importance of embracing our true history. And telling the whole damn truth. And so much of the conversation that is happening in the sort of public space right now is about sort of squashing some of the history that's less attractive or that's more painful. And her essay really forces us to look at where we are and how we got here and to tell the whole story. And so part of the work we're doing at National Geographic is broadening the pool of who the storytellers get to be and what stories get told. And
that's
so
important, Deborah, when you talk about storytelling and you talk about journalism. I often look at the landscape of storytelling and journalism in its entirety, and I talk to a lot of young journalists, emerging journalists, journalists who have decades of experience. And so that becomes a sticking point too, because if we're not in the newsrooms, if we're not able, to get these contracts that are going to pay us what we're worth, then we don't have that representation to really get the stories out, which is why what you're doing with National Geographic is it's beyond important. It's actually critical, actually. What do you want to say just about the state of journalism today? And how do we get, younger people just coming out of college to really get on board the accuracy of storytelling when they are looking at spaces, like blogs, like, headlines that are clickbait, when it's about being a television personality versus being a journalist.
So there are so many questions wrapped in that question that you asked.
Because I know I don't have my half hour with you. I know I don't have my half hour, and I'm trying to get it all. I'm like, wait a minute, Deborah, I got to talk to her.
So there's so much that we can say. And one of those things is, I think those of us who've been in the industry a long time, I've been in the industry 35 years, we just got to wrap our arms around the young people and make sure that they have the tools to be successful, and also listen to what they can sort of help us with and figure out how we can be in this together. But I do think there are a number of young people who have stories to tell, They have the journalism training and chops to be able to tell those stories, and the contracts are gettable. One thing that resulted last summer is more organizations really looking for authentic voices of young journalists of color to tell stories. One of the things that we're doing is opening up spaces for young journalists. We created a residency program where we have 4 residents who are very early in their careers, who have spent a year or 2 with National Geographic before they either become full-time permanent employees or go on elsewhere. And sometimes people are critical of those programs because they say, oh, well, you're putting people in at the entry level. But in order for people to get experience to move into the more senior levels, they have to start somewhere. And so in addition to hiring young people, we've also hired a number of managers of color, Black women and Latino women and South Asian women at the top of our sort of food chain to make sure that we have leaders as well as people new in their careers who are doing this work. And it really has been fulfilling. One of the stories that we did on Tulsa is written by our history fellow. I'm the history and culture editor, and the fellow, the resident, graduated from Morehouse College in 2020 and started working at National Geographic a couple months later. And in doing the research for the Tulsa story, discovered that his great-great-great-grandfather was one of the richest people in the United States, one of the creators of Tulsa's Greenwood District. And he's been all over the airwaves telling his Tulsa story. And so National Geographic—
oh my God, Deborah, this gives me goosebumps.
It's amazing.
This is amazing.
And so National Geographic opened the door for Tucker to discover his own family's truth and to tell that story. And that's one example. You know, people would say, yes, that's one small example. But if we across the industry did this kind of work, I think we would be in a much better place. And so I think there's huge opportunity for the young people who are here in spite of all of the challenges. But I do think that media leadership is where the obligation resides to make sure we are opening the door for young journalists of color to be able to give us authentic stories.
That's pretty remarkable. I'm glad to hear this, and I know my question was loaded, but I'm just like, oh my God, I have X amount of time to get this in, because I speak with so many young people, and they're like, TANISHA, you know, they want us to do 5 jobs on one salary, and that just isn't doable. How do you get a solid? How do you really get solid programming with that? You know, how do you get a product that's healthy and sustainable and viable when there's this rush, get it out. So
that for those of us who, you know, came up in the old school print where you at least had till the end of the day because the newspaper didn't come out till the next day, this sort of race to sort of post and publish immediately, while it has had some benefits, there also have been some drawbacks. And the point that you're making is one of those points. Unfortunately, because we live in the digital age, I think we have to figure out how to do both, right? We've got to be able to post now and do the more thoughtful story. So for National Geographic, that's important and challenging because we've got a website that needs to be fed constantly. But we also have a magazine that comes out monthly. So, you know, we're doing the sort of every hour stories, we're doing the weekly stories, we're doing the monthly stories. And figuring out how to manage that really, I think, is one of the challenges of journalism leaders of the 21st century. But we have to have those young voices. We have to have diverse voices. I think that doors are opening, not enough. We've got to figure out how to do it all. But I think it starts sort of one history resident at a time. And so we now know the story of J.B. Stratford because our history intern was able to tell that story. You know, we had known about him, we had known some of his story, but now we know so much more. And really, that's a metaphor for what the industry should be doing across the board. Having said that, I also want to shout out some veteran journalists like Deneen Brown, who started working on Tulsa several years ago before HBO's Watchmen when most people had never heard of it.
Yeah.
And so there are so many resources. Other people who are experts in some of these stories are the historians at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Mary Elliott is one of my favorite people. Just in having a casual conversation with her over cocktails, there's a history lesson to be had. But what ends up happening is not enough of these stories translate to meaningful journalism that the general population gets. And so we have to figure out a way to do that. So in this stage of my career, I'm really committed to sort of opening up the floodgates and inviting as many storytellers in as possible so more of our stories can be told.
I love what National Geographic is doing. Just being able to just, get a really tight lens, on the history of African-American contributions and, the atrocities too. I can't wait to see Tulsa. I cannot wait. I just got a media invite for the premiere, which is happening, I believe, next Friday. So I definitely cannot wait to see it. I love what Nat Geo did with the Aretha Franklin story with Cynthia Erivo. I mean, it's just like the list goes on and on and on. What is the future of Nat Geo just in terms of its film component, and storytelling in that capacity?
Well, it's an interesting question. Within the last 18 months or so, National Geographic has become part of Disney, the Disney company. And so right now we're in the process of figuring out where the synergies are. And so I think the questions about the future are really timely. And we're not sure what that is going to look like exactly right now. But what we do know is no matter the configuration of the company, we are committed to diverse storytelling, and we want to continue this trajectory of telling African-American stories. So you mentioned genius Aretha. Aretha was the third genius in the series. The first had been Albert Einstein, and the second had been Pablo Picasso.
Oh, wow.
Aretha was the third genius. And those are just a few examples. But if you look at Nat Geo across the board, we do a lot with animals. We do a lot with space. A recent animal show started that was called Critter Fixers, and the vets on that show are Black doctors. And so we are really looking across the board. Where can we make a difference in terms of who we're putting in front of the camera, whose stories we're telling, who the writers are. And then one of the stories I haven't talked about yet that you asked about at the beginning of this conversation was the third big story in the June issue. And that's Michelle Norris's Race Card Project. And that story really gets at people's inner feelings about race. Black people as well as other people. And so Michelle, a decade ago, asked people to write in 6 words what their feelings are about race. And 10 years later, and 500,000 race cards later, she is still receiving cards, and we are learning more about how people really feel. And some of these cards are just powerful. It's people talking about how their parents have responded to them, or how their grandparents have responded, or their own views. One person wrote in this current issue, "With kids, I'm dad, alone thug."
Wow.
Another person wrote, "Grandma gave me $100 when we broke up." And that person was talking about her grandmother not being open to the fact that she had a Black boyfriend. And so when you hear these 6 words and then you hear the backstories, in some cases it's heartbreaking. One sort of Black woman wrote, "I wish he was a girl. I wish he was a girl." Because she's worried about her Black son and what he's going to have to endure. A young Black woman wrote, "We are not all strong Black women. We're not all strong Black women." And so when you just, the sort of heart-wrenching nature of some of these cards really is a place for us to begin a more thoughtful conversation about our beliefs about race and the impact of race. And so right now we're encouraging people to write their own race cards and send them in.
I
So
was going
think
to say
about your
that's a
6
great
words.
exercise. That is, I mean, there are several that you mentioned that resonated with me, especially the one about, of course, being a strong Black woman. And then, I wish he was a girl, but I'm just like, wow, women are women. We experience just as much pain as men, as Black men.
Exactly.
I mean, it's always this
One
conversation I have with my friends when we're like, okay, where's the outrage for Black women, when we are victims?
Exactly. One person wrote, I'm ashamed accomplished Blacks surprise me. I'm ashamed accomplished Blacks surprise me.
Well, oh, woo!
And so it's like, okay, tell us how you really feel. And so these 6 words are really sort of stripping people's issues down to their essence.
Wow.
We had a now sort of older pair, right? 41 went in, 38 came out. And that was a story about taking some Black children from Florida to Louisiana to look at HBCUs. And then on the way back, they stopped at a hotel in Mississippi and they went into the water. They went into the river to swim. And some white men with a boat came and revved the water really high near where the kids were swimming, and 3 of the children drowned. And so when you read 41 went in, 38 came out, that doesn't necessarily mean a lot because you don't know what it means. And then when you hear the backstory of these Black babies dying because somebody had the audacity to take them to visit colleges, it just really sort of breaks your heart. And so this work has just been really powerful.
It's remarkable. It's remarkable beyond measure. When we talk about historical Black colleges and universities, what do we need to do to keep them, again, sustainable? I'm a graduate of the oldest HBCU, Cheyney University of Pennsylvania, founded in 1837. I am a 2nd generation Cheyney alum.
Wow.
My late father, who just passed away of COVID-19 at the top of the year. We graduated 20 years apart from each other. I went to Cheyney solely because that's where my daddy went. It wasn't even a conversation. If my daddy went to Princeton or Yale, it probably, without a doubt, would have been Princeton and Yale for me. However, it was Cheyney. And Cheyney, like so many other HBCUs, barely have their head above water in terms of retention, in terms of quality of education, in terms of facility, in terms of access, and yet in the conversation, you would think there were only 3 HBCUs. Howard, Spelman, Morehouse, Howard, Spelman, Morehouse, Howard, Spelman, Morehouse.
And then Hampton's in that conversation a lot. But to your point, and to speak to National Geographic, so we actually did a story in 2018 on HBCUs and the fact that HBCUs are in a period where they're thriving, comparatively speaking, when you look at the past few decades. And one of the things this moment has opened up is a resurgence in HBCU enrollment, which, if it can be sustained, I think can address some of the questions that you've raised. The racial reckoning has also led to a lot of guilt and a lot of philanthropy. So more than those 3 or 4 schools that often get named have been the sort of the beneficiary of a number of huge philanthropic gifts that I think will make a difference. But I think your larger point about what is the sustainable approach to ensure the viability of HBCUs is a conversation that needs to happen. One of the stories I'm editing now is a story about the sustainability of HBCUs, given the financial challenges, given the sort of facilities, given all these issues that we have to contend with. When you look at the sort of levels of sophistication in the technology at a lot of other schools, and we know that HBCUs in many cases haven't been able to keep up. What needs to happen to support HBCUs? What needs to happen to support HBCU athletics when so many of the athletes that could help fortify these schools end up going to predominantly white institutions? For a whole host
these are definitely the conversations that we have to have, because I wonder, like, where is the collective work? Where is the collective work? And why are the same 3 or 4, your opinion, Hampton 2, the same schools mentioned over and over and over and over and over and over again? I don't know the last time you visited a HBCU or went on an HBCU tour, but there is definitely a serious struggle, the quality of life in a dormitory, just not having access to scholarships, not having access to interns, not having access to internships.
Right.
There's just so many things that are happening. I'd be hard pressed to even think that a Cheney University student would even know about a program that Nat Geo has to bring in young journalists.
So interestingly enough, one of the things that we did at National Geographic last summer, when all hell was breaking loose and the racial reckoning was underway, is invited a group of HBCU students to help us cover the story in Washington, D.C. And so if you look at our coverage of the Get Off Our Necks, March for Jobs and Freedom, the commemoration of the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington, we had a half dozen HBCU students who were on the mall that day helping us. And Nat Geo TV actually had a cherry picker and was shooting like from on high, the crowd on the ground. And they had a number of young people working with them as well. And I'm proud to say that it was a diverse group from schools like Morgan State and other places, as well as Howard, which is based right there. But to your point, we have to do a better job in the industry. We've got to develop more relationships. Disney actually has an HBCU Connects program. And so I think at least for Nat Geo, becoming part of that Disney cooperative will give us access to many more students across the board. Right before COVID, I went to the annual UNCF conference and actually was talking to some young women in Tuskegee's veterinarian program, because I just, as I mentioned a little while ago, Nat Geo, does a lot with animals. Yeah. And, but also in that group were young sort of emerging journalists and others. And businesses hold a responsibility to figure out how to connect with HBCUs and their students. So in the same way that I wish there were more ways for students to be able to reach out, I think businesses also have that obligation. But there's also the benefit of organizations like NABJ that can be helpful in this regard. Yeah. I know a number of media organizations have gone to NABJ and said, help, we've got this program. We don't have enough applicants for it. Yeah. And so figuring out how to connect the jobs with the people and the sort of students with the opportunities is the serious lifting that needs to be happening right now.
You know what, Deborah, what I would like to see happen, I would like to see leadership in the news organizations, newsrooms throughout the country or the world over, for that matter, because we are global now. Mm-hmm. For those people, let's say, for example, Kim Godwin-Webb, who was just named vice president of ABC.
Right.
Okay. Big deal. Kim used to be my boss years ago when I worked at NBC 10 in Philadelphia, which started out as an internship program for me. So let's just say we have Kim, who has, a young TANISHA. TANISHA, why don't you go back to your university and recruit? And I don't know if that is like, what are we doing? Like, what is happening once we get in these key positions? It's almost like we get in and then we forget to really pull back unless the person that we're pulling from is like right there, and that's when I think about Howard, because it's about proximity, for so many people.
Right. I mean, I think that's a great question. I do think there are people whose job it is to make sure we are pulling, and not just pulling the people we know or pulling the people who are immediately in front of us. As I mentioned, I was at the UNCF conference. That's because that was a formal Disney program to be at the UNCF conference and to make sure scholarship opportunities and internship opportunities and entry-level jobs for people who are getting ready to graduate were all in the mix and a part of the conversation that was happening there. I do think there needs to be more sustained efforts and not just one company or one conference or one sort of Black organization or, or not just NABJ or not just the sort of Black accountants or the Black MBAs or the Black doctors or what have you. I do think there needs to be more work across the board to make sure that, we are carrying as we climb.
I love that.
But I also think that the more Black leaders you have in senior positions, the wider the net that gets cast for the number of people you are able to elevate. And so I think that's part of the responsibility that I personally have as a news leader, to make sure, when I retire, there are going to be some news leaders who I have helped prepare for this moment.
Deborah, you're amazing. Thank you so much. Carry as we climb. You guys, that is the message. Carry as we climb. Deborah, you are doing absolutely, the work that you're doing is just remarkable. You're a Neiman Fellow with Harvard University. There's just so much to your resume, and I'm just so grateful to have had this time for you. Any final words that you would like to say in the spirit of carry as we climb regarding National Geographic and all the wonderful work that Nat Geo is doing about the greater conversation on race?
Well, again, I just want to thank you for inviting me to be here. And I think that it's important for us not just to talk about the work that we want to do, but to actually demonstrate our commitment in the work that is published. And I think the body of work that National Geographic has published during the past couple years, and not just since George Floyd, we were doing this work even beforehand, I think is an impressive body of work. I think we've introduced people to the lived experiences of Black people in this country that they were not previously aware of. And for those who are aware, it's an opportunity for a more complete story about our experiences to be told. And so I think broadening the lens and making sure that our stories are out there is part of what Nat Geo has always done. And right now we're doing it as it relates to African Americans. And I'm just really happy about that.
Thank you so much for your time, Deborah. Again, you guys, National Geographic, you got to tune into all the programs that Nat Geo is doing. Get a subscription, don't miss out. Don't miss out on the contributions that Nat Geo is making to African American culture and the culture at large. Again, thank you so much for your time today and for tuning in to Niche Laverne Grant's BlackInAmerica.com.